So this is number 1 in how many in the series? Okay. So hopefully this will be interesting, at least not boring. And we'll end by 1. What I will try to do is, I only have about 8 slides, and just to give us enough background. And then really I want to have a discussion because your questions are probably the most important thing. I did get a couple of questions by email that I put a couple slides in to try to address. But again, the plan is to allow at least 30 minutes for us to have a discussion. And that way we'll get to the things that you're interested in. How many of you are planning an academic career, meaning like being a professor? Okay, I'm not. And how many are looking at industry? Okay, yeah. So I've never worked in industry, which is a whole other discussion because I used to teach at a business school where I met a lot of people who, ran businesses, and it seemed like kind of an interesting thing to do. I've never done it, but if I were to start life over again, I might look at it. Okay, we're great. Okay. Maybe we should start. It's 12 o'clock, right? Okay. Well, again, welcome. My name is Wesley Young. Oh, hi, come on in. There should be a sign-up sheet going around. Hi, how are you? So my name is Wesley Young. I'm the Director of Services for International Students and Scholars. And my understanding of the way this particular discussion was advertised was a chance for you to ask questions to compare what it's like maybe to be a faculty member at a small liberal arts college compared to maybe a staff person at a large research university. I mean, that's my only experience, and so that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. But one thing I want to make sure that I emphasize, and I have it in some of the slides, but this is just my experience. And it's really, really hard to generalize about higher education in general in the United States. It's hard to generalize about large research universities. It's hard to generalize, especially about small liberal arts colleges. The one I taught at it's now called Dominican University of California, located just north of San Francisco in San Rafael in Marin County. But let me start, and then again, as I said, hopefully we'll have a lot of time for discussion. Okay, here's the overview. I'm going to give you a sense of my educational background, graduate school, international experience, and then I've only worked 2 places my whole life. So again, for my generation, I don't think that's necessarily unusual. For your generation, maybe it will be. And so again, things don't always translate. So when I finished graduate school, I was an adjunct. That means part-time, temporary, looking for a real career job for about 3 years. And like many adjuncts in the United States, and this is pretty common. In fact, one thing I would recommend that everybody read if you're planning to stay in higher education, whether it's research or teaching or both, in the United States is the Chronicle of Higher Education. I wish that I had read that when I was a graduate student, because there are a lot of articles aimed at graduate students who are, pretty close to the job market or in the job market, and just a lot of things that I would have done differently. So, like many adjuncts in the United States, because pay is low, and you're only contracted to teach 1 or 2 classes at each institution. I was running around from place to place, and at the time I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, in the East Bay and Alameda. So I taught a couple classes at Dominican. It was called Dominican College at the time. I taught a couple of classes at Berkeley. That's where I did my PhD. And there was a professor on sabbatical, so I took his courses. And then St. Mary's College, another private in the Bay Area, larger than Dominican. I think now it's about, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000. So a decent size. And they have Division I basketball. Okay, so, and I'll go through these pretty quickly because it's really just to give you a context for our discussion later on. So I was a graduate student in the political science department. Anybody in humanities or social sciences? Okay, good. Okay, third. The rest of you are in STEM fields, physics, chemistry, engineering. So I was in the political science department. My concentrations were international relations, comparative politics, and East Asia. That was my dissertation title, just to give you a sense of maybe my marketability or lack thereof. What I found was difficult for me in looking for an academic job. In political science, there are different subfields. And if you look at my dissertation, it's not clear whether I really belong in international relations or comparative politics, right? And so that actually was a problem. I'm sure there were other problems, but that was one. And then I was a teaching assistant, a research assistant, instructor for, I was a TA and an RA almost every semester of when I was at Berkeley. So I had a lot of teaching experience by the time I finished. But TAs at Berkeley meant you were leading a discussion section. At least that's what it meant in political science. Okay, so the first time I actually taught an entire class myself was a summer session class at Berkeley. Okay, and then just a real briefly of my international experience. And this is, again, other than traveling for fun and other things like that. But I was an undergraduate actually here at UC Davis. Graduated in 1979. And I never got to study abroad when I was an undergrad, and I really wanted to. And so a friend of mine said, well, why don't you just go after you graduate? So I never thought of that. So I did. So I spent the academic year, 79, 80, in southern France, studying French language and culture. The problem of doing it the way I did was that I had just graduated. I did not need a degree. I did not need to transfer courses. So I was not a very serious student. So my French was not very good. If there was a test, I didn't go to class. I just went to the cafe. So, I was much more serious in 86, 87 when I spent the year at the Stanford Center in Taiwan. That was during the Berkeley years. So I was wanting to get enough language. I had taken 3 years of Chinese at Berkeley. And so this was advanced Chinese, and the plan was to do, I wanted to do field work in China, and so I was trying to get my Chinese to be good enough to do that. So I was quite serious that year. Chinese for me was much more difficult than French, so I think in the end my French was still better. But and then anyway, and then in 1995, this is while I was teaching at Dominican College, I had a chance to go to China to teach a couple courses during the summer. So I did that. Okay, so I was at Dominican College or Dominican University of California for a total of 12 years, if you include the 2 years I did as an adjunct, and then the other, I guess, 10 years as a faculty member. And started as, when I was an adjunct, as an instructor, and then once I got a full-time job as an assistant professor, I think about 4 or 5 years later, promoted to associate professor, and then that's when I came here. So Dominican University is very small, 1,200 undergraduate and graduate students combined. Okay, that's not unusual in the United States to have colleges that are that small. If you're familiar with United States high schools, it's actually smaller than some high schools, smaller than Davis High. I taught undergraduate and graduate courses. These were some of the courses that I taught. And so the reason I listed this, not because it really matters that much to most people, but if you remember what my concentrations were in graduate school, it's international relations, comparative politics, with basically a focus on East Asia, right? Okay, here I'm teaching, the first class I taught as an adjunct, politics of Western Europe. Bad idea, I think, but at small schools, especially very small schools, now it depends, right? It depends. There is a whole range of small liberal arts colleges in the United States. some that are very selective, very difficult to get into, attract the best students. Dominican was maybe closer to the other end, right? I mean, they hired a lot of, and they still do hire a lot of part-time instructors. And at small schools, in general, you kind of do what you need to do, right? And they ask you to do a lot of different things, and you'll see that later on. So I taught politics of Western Europe. I taught U.S. government. I had TA'd for U.S. government in class, I think, one semester at Berkeley, but that was about it, in addition to taking the class as a freshman. And then the rest of these were closer to my expertise. The other thing I did, and you'll see later, I was the director of graduate business programs at Dominican, which again, given my background, I had no business doing. But again, at small schools, sometimes you're asked to do a lot of different things. And again, depending on where you are, depending on the school, the pay can be much lower than a larger, research university, right? Like Davis. And so when I was first hired, I was on a 9-month contract. By the time I started full-time in 1994, we had 1 kid, then a couple of years later we had 2, and I was on a 9-month contract. When I got hired, my annual salary was slightly less than $35,000 a year, and I felt lucky to get that. Okay, this was in 1994. But I really wanted to make some more money, and so sometimes you do things, you make choices that in retrospect are not the best thing for your academic career. So again, if I were to go back, and if I was really serious about wanting to publish, about moving to a larger school, moving to a research university, running a business school would have been a bad idea, right? But again, I liked Dominican a lot. I liked the small school atmosphere. We'll talk about culture later. You knew everybody, right? There were maybe 40 full-time faculty, right, in the whole campus, the whole college. And so when they were looking for someone to teach in the international MBA program, these are courses that I taught. And they needed somebody to teach cross-cultural communication, so I did that too. And you go to the library and you know how to do research, how to do that. But small school, right? That would never happen, or I don't think it would happen because I'm not a faculty member here, but I doubt that would happen at a larger institution where you're much more specialized. Right? Okay, and this is just a sampling of some of the different titles that I had. So again, you can see I was all over the map, right? My second year, they made me chair of the political science department. If you're a junior faculty somewhere at a larger university, one, they probably won't do that. And it's for a couple of reasons. One is you don't have enough experience, and two, they want you to get tenure. So being chair takes some time, right? So you don't want administrative duties at a large research university when you're supposed to be published, because it takes some time. Okay, Dominican didn't care about publishing, which was fine with me, okay? Number one thing that they cared about was teaching and campus service, right? But you can see that I did a number of things. I was an acting chair of the International Languages Department for a couple of years. Again, Division of Graduate Business. I was a one-person study abroad advisor, one-person international student advisor. And we didn't have international scholars, we didn't have postdocs. So I did all this. Okay, here, UC Davis, I've been here since 2003. One title, right? Director of Services for International Students and Scholars. So again, if you're coming here as a faculty member, my guess is you'll stay in the same department the whole time you're here. If you're in a tenure track, you would move from assistant professor, associate professor, full professor. Okay, that's the normal track at a large research university. This campus also hires lecturers, and that's for people who are not necessarily interested in publishing, so you have a heavier teaching load. But even as a lecturer here, you would probably only teach in one department, or you would teach in a fairly narrow range of courses, right? And it's the same, well, staff positions are a little bit different. I've stayed in one position. I don't think that's unusual necessarily. It kind of depends. I mean, it depends on your personal preference, right? If you're coming here as an administrator, so my position is kind of a mid-level administrative position. And so when I came here 15 years ago, I guess if I had thought about it, I could have thought about, well, what else can I do to get promotions? Okay, and promotions for me, as a person coming as a staff person, right, not as a faculty person. So publications don't matter for staff. What I would have been looking at would probably have been in student affairs to move up to, there are different positions. There are assistant vice chancellors of student affairs, associate vice chancellors of student affairs, things like that. But I would have had to move around probably in student affairs to get more experience to move up. I was really interested in international, and this department was a good fit for me. Personally, I wasn't looking to build my resume to advance. So this has been a good place for me at Davis. But again, you can see that I've never been asked to have all kinds of different titles like I was at a small school. So again, one of the big differences, I think, between some small liberal arts colleges, because again, there's a whole range of small colleges, right? But at least Dominican, which is at the smaller end, is you can either call it an opportunity or a bad thing that, you're going to be doing a lot of different things. I actually liked it when I was younger, and I thought I would retire there because I really enjoyed the culture and everything else, and the opportunity to learn a lot of different things. But anyway, by the time I got here, I really wanted to focus on. Okay, so making the adjustment. The adjustment that I had to make was in several areas. One was an adjustment from a faculty position to a staff position. And that was one of the questions I got in email in advance. What are the differences? One is status, okay? At an American university, faculty are on top. Staff are sort of second. And depending on who you are, students could either be at the very top or the very bottom. I think it depends on who you ask.
Here?
I think it depends on who you ask.
No, I didn't hear this.
Right, I think it depends on who you ask.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, some people will tell you that students are the most important thing, because without students, we wouldn't exist, right? I mean, we wouldn't. If we had no students, graduate students, undergraduate students, we'd be gone. So in that sense, students are the most important thing. And there have been chancellors that talk about a student-centered university, talking about Davis. Okay, so some people will argue students are the most important people on campus. If you ask students that, I don't know if you would get that answer. That's why I'm saying, depending on who you ask, some people will say students are the most important people on campus, and some people might say, well, students really are not. But it's clear that faculty in any university or college in the United States, faculty have more status than staff. Okay, that's just, I've never heard of a university that is a very flat organization. There's always this hierarchy. The other thing that was different was independence. When I was a faculty member, I could kind of come and go when I wanted, which was great when our kids were young. So my wife worked in the stock market. She traded over-the-counter stocks. So she worked New York hours. I didn't leave home till 9 o'clock in the morning. I took care of the kids in the morning, got them to school, and then she was home by, well, the market closes at 1:30 in the afternoon, so she was home by 2. So we had somebody come in to watch our kids for a few hours in between. But, and then I came home later at Dominican. I was teaching the we had an MBA program that was an evening program, so I often taught in the evening, so I come later. But, you know, I didn't have hours. I mean, I didn't have to punch the clock. I never counted hours. I just came to campus when I needed to, and I left campus when I didn't need to. And my sense that at large universities like Davis, it's kind of the same thing. You have a lot of independence in terms of your individual schedule, right? I'm sure that for you graduate students and even postdocs, you probably know, right? The faculty that you want to talk to, maybe they're here today, maybe they're not here tomorrow. Here in my job as a staff person, even as the director, I really need to be here from 8 to 5. Most staff jobs are 8 to 5. Or there's some flexibility. So we have staff that come in early and leave early, or come in late and leave late. But you're expected to be at work on a regular schedule. So that's a big difference. And then supervision of staff, most faculty don't have a lot of supervisory responsibilities unless they have administrative parts to their job, like they're a dean or they're a department chair or something like that, right? Then they would have supervisory responsibilities. But a lot of that supervision is supervising faculty, which is completely different than supervising staff, right? Because because faculty want independence, and you kind of leave them alone for the most part. So if you want a job where, you know, as long as you do a good job, people will leave you alone for the most part, you want to be a faculty member. Okay. As a staff person, you clearly have a boss who will probably, you know, give you an evaluation each year of how you're doing. And if you're in an administrative position, you will have staff that you have to supervise, meaning, well, it gets complicated, but let me tell you, it's a whole lot harder than supervising faculty. Okay? And I think that's why most staff, even at the administrative higher levels, we don't last 40 years, right? So in the UC system, we have a great retirement system. Just kind of a sideline. If you work at the university for 40 years, you keep your 100% of your salary in retirement, right? 40 years. So if you start here as an assistant professor, let's say you're 35, you can easily make 40 years, right? There are not many staff that make 40 years because it's hard. I mean, just supervising people. Well, so don't get me wrong. Faculty, I think, work very hard too. In fact, I think to be a faculty member at a research place like Davis, this is just my opinion. I think you have to be kind of a workaholic. I mean, you have to be able to work really long hours. I mean, you will be motivated though, because you're doing what you love, right? So most faculty work long hours, they work on weekends, they work through the summer. But it's usually something that you would want to do even if you didn't get paid. Okay. So a lot of faculty last, you know, unless they go somewhere else, but a lot of faculty will last 40 years, 35, 40 years. Okay. So there was also the difference of moving from a private Catholic college to a public university. So rules are a little bit different. There was probably, and again, this depends on where you are, but when I was at Dominican, there weren't a lot of rules. The bureaucracy was quite small. So I had a boss, the dean that I worked for, and this was in a very small, all the units in the campus were smaller, right, because it's smaller. But we would have our own happy hour, he would have wine and stuff, and you just close the door and you have alcohol. And that's really hard to do at a public university. I mean, you can't do that. You can get a permit to serve alcohol, but it's harder to do things like that. There's just a lot more rules. Sometimes, though, rules are a good thing, right? I mean, there was very little bureaucracy when I was at Dominican. So the registrar's office was in the same building that my office was in. The registrar was downstairs. When I was running the study abroad office, I could walk downstairs, work out a deal with the registrar in terms of units for our study abroad program. We'd make an agreement, and it was done in a day. I could walk across the street, have a conversation with the president, because again, a small school, you could walk across the street and talk to the president, make an agreement, and it was done. There were not always committees and all that stuff that's here. So that's the good part of little bureaucracy. I learned later that bureaucracy also protects you from certain things. Okay? So, there's politics in every institution, right? There's politics in every institution. I think there's less control. Well, the politics can get very personal at small schools. And I think in general, and again, it depends, right? So I don't want to overgeneralize. But at Dominican, there was much less protection for people if you did not have a good relationship with somebody than a place like here that has rules. Okay. And then, as I mentioned, when I say hats, that means many different jobs, different types of jobs. So at most small schools, you have the opportunity to do a lot of different things, whereas at most large universities, you focus on one. Okay, so there was a question about visa issues. And again, the answer is it depends, but in general, large research universities hire more international faculty and staff. Okay, I mean, our office does all the immigration work when we hire a new assistant professor who is not a US citizen or does not have a green card, right? That allows the person to work. If they're tenure track and they end up staying, we help that person get a green card. At schools that are as small as Dominican, that is probably not going to happen. And it may happen at some small schools, probably more elite ones, right? But I think it's more common to have international faculty, to have international staff at a larger institution. And just to use Davis as an example, we use the J1 visa for visiting scholars and postdocs, okay? Never for career positions, though. Assistant professor doesn't come in on a J, right? We use the H1B for specialty occupations, and that's kind of a complicated definition, but in general, it's only for academic positions, generally not for staff. There are a few exceptions, but generally, they're for faculty and researchers, right? And newly hired faculty are often, we get them an H1B, okay? So UC Davis is a huge H1B employer, right? At one time, maybe 10 years ago, we were in the top 100 H1B of the largest H1B employers in the country. I'm sure that's not true now, but I'm pretty sure UC Davis is one of the largest H1B employers in the Sacramento region and probably the state of California. Okay, and then there's a question about permanent residence as well. At least here at UC Davis, the campus will help you get a green card only if you're in a permanent position. So if you're a postdoc, you'll have to get your own green card. I mean, there's lots of ways to get a green card, right? But one way is to have the sponsorship of the university. We will not do that for postdocs. We will not do that for most lecturers because they're not considered permanent positions. There are some lecturer positions that are considered permanent, but it's just a campus policy, okay? And different universities will be different. Okay, another question was, do you need a PhD? And again, it depends, meaning do you need a PhD to work in higher education? I think at most four-year universities, most of the time, you will be required to have a PhD, or at least a terminal degree. So if you're teaching in a law school, it means a JD. If you're in the fine arts, it means an MFA, right? Is it 100% required? No, there are examples. You'll find examples of faculty that do not, but it's not that common. common. For staff positions, a PhD can be an advantage sometimes, but it's certainly not. It's not generally required. Okay? If I look at my counterparts across the UC system, about half of us have PhDs. You don't need a PhD to do my job. The person who hired me felt it was important, not because it gave me skills to do what I need to do in this job, but the person who hired me felt it was very important, and I actually agree with this, that it was important to understand faculty and to understand the academic work that happens on this campus. And, you know, and given my experience, he thought I had that. So that's really all that I have, and I thought hopefully, okay, good. About a half an hour, yes.
If I want to work as a lecturer, meaning I don't want to do research, do you think there's an advantage of PhD compared to an MA?
I would think yes, especially at four-year universities, I would think. And one way to check is what department are you? Communications. I mean, see the lecturers, and most departments on campus, they'll have web pages for all faculty, often including lecturers. And I think it's fairly common that a person will post their CV or at least their educational background. So I know the university writing program uses a lot of lecturers. Chemistry uses lecturers. Does communications use lecturers? Yeah, I would just take a look at the ones that have been hired and see if they have PhDs. But I would guess that most of them do, or even if it's not required, I would think that at most in higher education, whether you're at a four-year university or even a community college, I think it would be an advantage.
I'm asking because I noticed that the job ads only mention MA.
Right, and I think that's because they want to give themselves flexibility in the hiring process. Also, depending on your discipline, a person coming in with significant work experience might make a difference. So, I mean, if you're a White House chief of staff and you want to come and teach public policy and you don't have a PhD, it may not matter because you've had that kind of experience, right? Or also, it's very common in MBA programs. Where they have instructors that come in that have very significant industry experience, you know, vice presidents and, you know, at very high levels, maybe they have an MBA, right? They probably don't have a PhD, but they're very valuable teaching staff. So I think depending on your discipline, it's probably an advantage, but I wouldn't say it's a requirement. Other questions?
Yep. This is about adjunct lecturing gigs. So how well do those scale up? Because I assume like if you're trying to make them like a livable salary, you probably need to go to multiple universities, and they might not know that you're teaching at another one.
Right. So again, take a look at the Chronicle of Higher Ed. And in the last couple of years, there have been a number of articles about adjuncts. Most of them not good, in the sense that you see adjuncts at various institutions trying to unionize to get better wages, better working conditions. There have been a couple of stories I've read about adjuncts that are homeless, living in their cars. I mean, I think that's not the norm. Okay. And honestly, I mean, these are people that say they love to teach. This is what they're born to do. Even if they're homeless, they're going to do it. If it were me, I would find something else to do. I mean, just to give you an example. So when I was at Berkeley, my wife also had a really good job. She worked for Dean Witter. She was trading over-the-counter stocks. That's the NASDAQ market. So that's not tech stocks like Apple and those kind of stocks. Really good job. And so when I finished, to not be mobile, to not be willing to move for an academic position really limits your options, right? So a lot of people told me, you know, if you're only going to stay in the Bay Area, forget about it. Your chances of getting an academic job are really small. They say the same things about academic couples. It's really hard to get two academic jobs at the same institution or even close. So then you go to big urban areas like Boston, LA, you know, Chicago, where there are a lot of universities, right, to improve your chances. But still, it's hard. When I was teaching as an adjunct, I think I made $2,000 a course at Dominican at the time. That was less than I made as a TA at Berkeley. Okay, I don't know what the salaries are like now. And even when I was an instructor at Berkeley, I think I got paid a little bit more than that, and maybe about the same as a TA. But yeah, it's very common for adjuncts to teach at multiple places. And of course, the hope is that one of those positions will turn into a full-time gig, right? So the problem is, so when I was in graduate school in the 80s, there were all these articles in the Chronicle of Higher Ed about the post-war, you know, the faculty who started in the older baby boomers, the faculty who started in the 60s, 50s, 60s were retiring, right? And there would be all these positions, academic positions in a number of different disciplines. And in political science, there would be all these jobs. Well, it turned out that it didn't work out that way. And that's because it coincided with the defunding of higher education by a lot of states in this country, and even a lot of private universities that did not have the kind of money that Harvard and Stanford and Yale have, right? Those are really unusual. They have endowments that are as big as some small countries, right? So that's not common. And so what happened when those faculty started retiring is they didn't all get replaced. I mean, some of them were replaced with tenure track positions, but many of those were replaced with adjunct positions, right? So you hire somebody on a contract, maybe there's some benefits, but not as good. You're not paying them as much. And so the market really didn't materialize the way it was supposed to. I was lucky, it worked out for me. So again, I was an adjunct 1 full year, started the second year, and then I really felt I was getting clinically depressed, right? And I know this sounds funny, but I was saved by country music. It's a long story, but it made me realize that, you know, life is hard sometimes, and that's normal. That's just normal, right? So I'm a country music fan to this day. But anyway, so I go to my dean and I said, look, you know, I really love teaching here, but I'm getting depressed. I can't make a living this way. And so I'll finish out the year. And then I started looking for jobs in industry. I started doing informational interviews. So I am a firm believer in informational interviews. No matter what your job goal is, whether it's in academia or in private industry, build your network, talk to people. I'm an introvert, right? It's really hard. It was really hard for me to talk to people that I didn't know, to make cold calls. So what you want to do is you tell everybody that you know that you're looking for work, even if they're not doing what you want to do, but maybe their neighbor does something or works at a university that you want to work at, or their uncle or their cousin. Because one thing I wanted to say is that, okay, I've only worked at 2 places, but every job that I got was helped by my network, okay? My adjunct job at Dominican, they were hiring a lot of, not only adjuncts, they were hiring a lot of Berkeley graduate students. So I had a classmate who was teaching in this MBA program at Dominican, and then she got a tenure track offer up in Washington State. But it was like 2 months before the semester was supposed to start. So she told the dean, look, I'm really sorry, but I'm leaving. But hey, I have a friend who can come in and teach this class. That was me. So I got the adjunct job, right? And then again, my second year, I told the dean, look, I can't keep doing this. I'm gonna go. But because they liked me, I mean, I did a good job, and I was willing to do all different kinds of things, even as an adjunct. They created a position for me. Okay? There was not even a recruitment. And so my colleague, who I got to know much better later in the psychology department, who was a graduate of Dominican College, who had to go through a national search, he said, how did you do that? They just hired you, and there was nothing. Well, as I said, at small schools, bureaucracies are different, less rules. And the dean that hired me was in a position, because of personal relationships and everything else, she could just hire me. So it was unusual. But so, and then even my job here, I had to go through a recruitment process. But one, I found out about the job through my network, right? Again, I was here as an undergrad, and a staff member that I used to work for emailed me because he knew I was looking for work. And he said, Wes, this position is going to be posted in a couple months. You know, you might want to apply for it. And then the associate vice provost at the time, who was not the decision maker, but he was like the second in command of the person making the decision about the hiring. We had both volunteered in a group in the Bay Area. It was an international higher ed. So I had worked with him on a volunteer basis on some projects for the last couple of years. So he was able to tell his boss, hey, this person, you know, hire. So, I mean, he couldn't make the decision, but he could vouch for me. He could say this is a good person. So build your network. I mean, that is, whether it's in academics or otherwise, go to conferences, meet people. Again, it was really hard for me to meet people because I'm an introvert. I don't know how many of you are introverts, but they say 80% of the world are introverts. But they also say 80% of statistics are made up. So I don't know. But anyway, what I did is I pretended that I was my brother-in-law, who was an extrovert, right? And I just did. And it was easy for me to pretend I was him because if I got rejected or whatever, that was not me, it was Dave. And then you keep doing it, and then you get to practice, and then it became used to. I mean, teaching was the same way. I mean, I TA'd many years, and that for me was the kind of practice I needed, because when I taught those classes at Berkeley, when one of the faculty were on sabbatical, so I was teaching 250 students in a big auditorium. I mean, like we have here, right? You've done that. And then I had TAs who could grade the exams. Yeah. So network, you know, but and you want to be mobile if you can, because sometimes those adjunct positions do turn into real jobs, but there are probably more stories when they don't. So I would always have a plan B. You know, there's another colleague of mine at Berkeley who was a political science, who got a PhD in political science, and his area of specialization was 19th century Germany. Now he got a job in Texas at a small college. He got a tenure track job, but he really didn't like it. You know, for whatever reason. So, and he decided to move back to California. Anyway, to make a long story short, he ended up, because of his research and writing skills, he got a job as a speechwriter for the CEO of Intel, right? It's a big semiconductor manufacturer. And then later, by working at Intel, he became the director of a unit that basically did industry, like, what did he call it? It's kind of like espionage. You know, it's not espionage, but it's, you know, you're doing research on the competition, right? But he knew how to do research, he knew how to do presentations, he knew how to write reports. So he used those skills that he gained as an academic and translated it to industry. He said he would never go back. So there are also a lot of stories of PhDs some of whom have started in academics and who have migrated to industry. I know 2 UC Davis PhDs who decided actually not to be academics while they were here. They finished the PhD, went into ecology, and got a job in student affairs at a university, and the other in linguistics, who is now a masseuse in Davis. So, you all guys. Yes.
Sometimes about courses that you have and then also
company, you know what you're looking for. So let me.
I assume you didn't apply for a job in European space.
Okay, well, no, but that was the first class that I taught as an adjunct.
Yeah.
So remember, I had just graduated. I had no job options. People were telling me, forget about staying in the Bay Area because it's just too hard. But my wife had a really good job. And I was thinking, well, maybe I get a job at a good public university in the Midwest. We lived there for 6 years. I don't get tenure. Then we're stuck in Iowa or Oklahoma. So at that point, you know, when he says, can you teach Western European politics? I go, yeah. Because, well, okay, so how many of you have TA'd here? Okay. So sometimes you TA in classes that are not really exactly what you're doing your research on. And I don't know how it is in your, but for me, and again, a TA at Berkeley was just running a discussion session, right? So it's easier. So you just stay ahead of the reading. And you're older, you have more experience than the undergrads, and you can lead a discussion. You're facilitating a discussion. But you're right, teaching is different. So I called a classmate of mine at Berkeley whose specialty was Western Europe. And I said, look, what are some good books to use for the syllabus? And so he gave me those. And I just made sure that I stayed ahead of the reading, you know, of the class. Yeah, I got the job.
But my question is more like, I noticed that when you interview places, they're looking for someone with all the experience. Like,
Yeah.
I know I can do it.
Yeah.
But how do you get that first chance?
Okay, well, so, I mean, if they were a serious school looking for someone to teach Western European politics, you're right, they would not have hired me. But it depends how small the school is, you know? I mean, I don't know how unusual Dominican is. I really don't. I mean, I do and I don't. I worked there for 12 years. They're fairly isolated in terms of higher education. To them and to the department chair, one, the recommendation from the person that teaching before was important. And the interview, I don't know. I mean, you know, a lot of interviews are based on how you feel about a person. But again, if it were, and I hate to use the word a more serious institution, they wouldn't have hired me. You're right. But it depends on what their options were, right? This was 2 months before the semester started. They needed somebody. They didn't know anybody at Berkeley. And I was saying I could political science. Well, also, again, think about the culture. Okay, the culture of a small school, and I think this is sort of true in general, is that you can kind of do stuff. I mean, you know, they're used to people operating a little bit outside of their specialty, outside of their comfort zone. So remember, even when I was working there as a full-time faculty member, because it wasn't until about 5 years down the line that they said, hey, do you want to run graduate business? And I said, okay, can I have a 12-month contract? And they said, yeah. But, okay, so it wasn't quite that disjointed. So this is an international MBA program with a focus on East Asia. Okay, so I don't have a business background, but I do have an academic background in East Asia, political economy, right? I've been teaching in the program for a number of years. I got good teaching reviews. It was just the business part that I didn't have. Now, if I were them, I'd be kind of concerned about that. But again, the culture of small schools is, yeah, you can do it though, right? You're smart, you get a PhD. So it depends. A lot of hiring and a lot of finding a job, number one is your network, but sometimes you get lucky, you know? So I bought a book called The 10-Day MBA, and you get the jargon and you start to, you know. But yeah, that's a good question. I don't know how to answer that because you're right. I wouldn't have applied for the job if it said we're looking for someone to teach Western European politics. Because, well, and actually, this was the first class I taught, but there were two classes that they wanted me to teach. One was in the international MBA program on Japan. So they had already decided to hire me to teach within my expertise. And the political science department needed someone to teach an undergraduate class. And since I was going to be there, I talked to the department chair. This is actually kind of funny. So I had an interview with the department chair. And I was asking him, well, how many faculty do you have in the political science department? He says, just me. And the rest were adjuncts, like, you know. So it's small. Yeah. So, you know, depends, right? Yeah. Yeah.
When you're applying for jobs at liberal arts colleges or colleges that are more focused on teaching, how do you frame your research? I feel like I've read about a trend recently that even if it's at a school that says that they value teaching more than research, you still have to have proof that you publish things and be an established research scholar, but also teach. How do you balance?
That depends on the school. So any of the more selective liberal arts colleges, I think that's going to be the case. And they would probably even, it would be beneficial if you could publish a few things. So, I mean, I'm talking about like the Claremont colleges down in Southern California, or certainly the more elite places, Oberlin or places like that, right? Where they would really like faculty to be, you know, fairly serious scholars, but also could teach well. So one is, so I think, you want to eliminate the jargon, right? Because even at an elite small liberal arts college, the department is going to be relatively small, and they may not have somebody even in your area. I mean, like even just political science is pretty broad, right? And there may be jargon in your field that is very narrowly focused, and you kind of want to get rid of that jargon. Most teaching positions, they have you do what's called a job talk. And the job talk can be just the faculty, or it can be sometimes coming in and teaching, you know, give us 30 minutes or 20 minutes of how you would teach a certain concept. So they kind of want to see you in action. But one, I think, for sure, you want the things that you write when you describe your research. I mean, even if you're applying for a Fulbright, okay? And, you know, there are how many, does everyone know what Fulbright is, right? They fund, this State Department money, they fund international research for PhD students. At a certain, there are two parts to the review process. One is by experts in your field, but even experts, you know, your research can be fairly narrow, right? But then there's also another committee of more general peers, and so you want to stay away from jargon. You want to be able to convince an intelligent non-expert that your research is important, right? That you have something to say. And so I would think the same thing, you know, because when you're a graduate student, you know, you're doing research on a very narrow area. And again, even within your department, there will be people who don't understand what you're doing. So you need to write your application or present things in a way where an intelligent person understands why this is important, and that you can communicate. I'll give you another tip while we're just talking about communicating. One thing, I learned this from my dissertation chair, who I PA'd for several times. He would always have an outline on the board, and I don't even know if they have used chalkboards anymore, but you know, however you do it, right, on the screen. And it wasn't a real detailed outline. It might have, you know, Roman numerals 1 through 5 with a couple of A, B, C, and for each one. But the thing about teaching undergraduates, and to some extent, well, okay, the thing about teaching undergraduates is if they don't understand something, the first person they're going to blame is themselves. Especially if you have an outline on the board, you obviously must be organized, Right? So maybe they just, oh, I haven't read enough, right? You know, and even, so you're graduate students, and this I'll just say about me, but I think it was not uncommon among us graduate students, that if we read an article that, or a piece, you know, for a seminar that we didn't understand, we assumed that it was our fault. Again, we didn't have enough background or something. But what I think is the case in most of the time, so, you know, in most big places, you have to publish to get promotions to keep going, right? So there are lots of journals, and I'm sure you've heard this before. Most things that are published, hardly anybody reads, right? There's only maybe 1 or 2% of the things that academics publish that are really so important that a lot of people read. So there are publications, peer-reviewed, whatever, that are created so people can publish, right? I think if you're a graduate student and you read something and it's hard to understand, it's because it wasn't well written. And it got published because that's what needs, I mean, I'll give you another thing going back to teaching. And this, so my last year at Berkeley, there was a new assistant professor that was hired, and I was talking to him. And he said when he's designing a syllabus, a class, he always has a list of 2 sets of readings, books, articles, whatever. And the best set he keeps for himself to write his lectures, prepare his lectures with. And then sort of the second best he gives to his students. Now, I wouldn't actually advocate that. I don't think that's a good idea. But that was one person's take on teaching, right? So, but again, having taught at a place, and I actually even Berkeley, right? So I taught a couple of upper division classes at Berkeley, and I think, you know, and maybe this is just true of political science where I was, but maybe it's generally true. The courses were really designed for people who wanted to get a PhD in political science. So you're reading all this stuff about theory and everything else. And really, it didn't matter if you were going to do lots of things, but it mattered if you were going to graduate school for political science. I think, and this goes back to the interview, trying to get a job at a teaching university, even though you have a research topic that you're maybe really interested in, is you want to be able to present things, again, in ways that it's not for a real specialized audience of 1 or 2 people. Okay? Because my guess is that the hiring committee doesn't know that much about your specific topic. And so you want to gear things toward an intelligent audience. So I think, and I think that works whether you're teaching or you're applying for a job. But having said that, I've only been to a couple of job talks. So when I was a graduate student at Berkeley, they invited graduate students to go to job talks for the faculty. So I went to a couple of those. So at a research university, you know, maybe it's a little bit different. I mean, one, I think you do have to be intelligible to intelligent folks who aren't going to get all the jargon, but you're going to want to show that you are an expert. Right? So if you're at a research university, the job talk's going to be a little. Okay, but if you take away one thing from this, you know, networking is an important thing to do. And that just means talking to people, getting to know people. Anybody from China here? Guanxi, right? Your connection. So it's, you know, in the United States, we say it's who you know that counts. That's actually not true. It's backwards. It's who knows you. Right. So whether you're looking for a job at a research university, a teaching college, an industry, whatever, you want to start building your network now. Because as a postdoc or as a graduate student, I think it's much easier to call somebody up, and it's best if you have somebody that can refer you, right? I'd love to talk to you for 30 minutes. So-and-so gave me your name and suggested I give you a call. I'm a graduate student at Davis, or I'm a postdoc at Davis, and I'd like to learn more about your company. You don't want to ask for a job, because if there's no job, they'll say, sorry, I don't have a job. You want information, right? So you learn about companies. What's the culture like? Right? Or different universities have different cultures. You learn about what's the culture. What is it like to teach at Dominican? What is it like to be a faculty member at UC Davis? I would guess that being a faculty member at Davis is not the same as Merced or Irvine or Stanford or wherever else. Every place is a little bit different, right? There may be a lot of common things, but there are things that are different. What is it like living in a certain place, right? But there's all kinds of questions that you can ask so that if you get that interview, you're a lot more prepared. And also you can decide, yeah, I'd really like to work there, or I really don't. Hopefully that helps. Well, I guess it's 1 o'clock. I'll let you go. Thank you very much. If you have other questions for me, feel free to call me, email me. I'm happy to